Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Patriot's History. I'm the co-author of Patriot's History of the United States, Larry Swikart. Reminder, Christmas is coming. I know it seems a long way away, but when you're dealing with giving books as gifts, autographed books, they have to go two places. They have to come to me, then they have to get to you. So be thinking about your orders. We have some Black Friday orders up that are just awesome, including new books that you haven't seen before. So get your orders in soon so that we can make sure they arrive to your loved ones or your friends by Christmas. Also, remember, you can give a subscription to either the VIP Insider or to the Wild World of Politics. I'm sorry, the Wild World of Politics Insider or the Wild World of History VIP, each of which contains 40 hours or more of videos, video lessons, including my Reagan series, my Churchill series that is ongoing, new stuff being added all the time, and my newest series on Wild World of Politics only, which is called Globalism, Then and Now, from my forthcoming book out on February 20th of 2024. Also, a little heads up, I plan to be on War Room with Steve Bannon this Thanksgiving. But remember, you can give these gift subscriptions just by contacting me, Larry at wildworldhistory.com, and telling me who you want to give the offer to. You can place the order, but make sure I get the email as to who the VIP is going to. All right, well, let's get started. We've been talking a lot about the Missouri Compromise and the restructuring of the political parties. And so today we're kind of going to get to see how that worked out with John Quincy Adams. And as always, I am reading from the 15th anniversary edition of Patriot's History. The 20th anniversary edition, which is in PDF, will be available next year sometime. It's done. I'm just waiting on the right moment to release it. And if you have an earlier edition, as I always say, depends on how early. The header should remain the same going back to before 2010, but after 10, certainly the pages aren't going to be the same unless you have the 15th anniversary edition. So I'm on page 216, and the header is Adams Stillborn Administration. At every turn, Adams found himself one step behind Jackson and the Van Buren machine. Lacking an affinity for the masses, even though he spent countless hours receiving ordinary citizens daily, dutifully recording their meetings in his diary, Adams seemed incapable of cultivating any public goodwill. In his first message to Congress, Adams laid out an astounding array of plans, including exploration of the far west, funding of Naval Academy, and a National Astronomical Observatory. And the institution of a uniform set of metric weights and measures. Then, in one of the most famous faux pas of any elected official, Adams lectured Congress that the members were not to be palsied by the will of their constituents. Dumb. Bad luck and poor timing characterized the hapless Adams administration, which soon sought to pass a new tariff bill to raise revenue for the government, a purpose that seldom excited voters. When the tariff of 1824 finally navigated its way through Congress, it featured higher duties on cotton, iron, salt, coffee, molasses, sugar, and virtually all foreign manufactured goods. Legislators enthusiastically voted for duties on some products to obtain higher prices for those made by their own constituents, hardly noticing that if all prices went up, what came into one hand went out with the other. Calhoun saw an opportunity to twist the legislation even further, giving the Jacksonians a political victory. He wrote a bill that introduced outrageously high duties on raw materials, which the Machiavellian Calhoun felt certain would result in the northeastern states voting it down with the agricultural states. Okay, so get this, Calhoun, who really opposes tariffs, writes a tariff component to the bill that is so high, he thinks that the pro-tariff Northeasterners will be forced to vote against it because it's just too high. But that doesn't work. Usually these people go, well, man, that's really extreme, but I guess I got to vote for it anyway. As legislation sometimes does, the bill advanced bit by bit, largely out of the public eye. What finally emerged threatened to blow apart the Union. The stunned Calhoun saw Van Buren's Northerners support it on the grounds that it protected his woolen manufacturing voters, whereas Daniel Webster, Massachusetts, one of those Calhoun thought would be painted into a corner, backed the tariff on the principle that he supported all protective tariffs, even one that high. Thus, to Calhoun's amazement and to the dismay of Southern and Western interests, the bill actually passed in May 1828, leaving Calhoun to attack his own bill. He penned anonymously the, quote, South Carolina Exposition and Protest, which quickly the tariff was dubbed the Tariff of Abominations. Don't try to get too cute in your legislation. That's the moral of that story. As the next election approached, on the one side stood Jackson, who, despite his military records, seemed a coarse man of little character, yet who had a wide array of experience as a general, congressman, state Supreme Court justice, Florida's territorial governor, and a U.S. senator. At the other extreme stood Adams, who thought that only character counted and who never had made a connection with ordinary citizens. Jackson and his followers believed in rotation in office, whereby virtually any individual could be plugged into any government job. The Whigs, on the other hand, emphasized character and social standing. To Adams and other later Whigs, simply stacking men of reputation in offices amounted to good government. Common experience at the end of Adams's term suggested that some men of character lacked sense, and some men of sense seemed to lack character. Therefore, sometime after Jefferson, the fine balance that demanded both effectiveness and honor among elected officials had taken a holiday. Header, The Rise of the Common Man. Hailed by many historians as the first true democratic election in American history, the contest of 1828 was merely a foregone conclusion owing to the charges of the corrupt bargain and the inept political traits of the incumbent Adams. The 4 years of the Adams administration actually benefited Van Buren's political machine, giving him the necessary time to line up the papers, place the proper loyalists in position, and obtain funding. By 1828, all the pieces were in place. Adams's supporters could only point to Jackson's, quote, convicted adulteress of a wife. The legal status of her earlier divorce had been successfully challenged, and his hanging of the British spies in Florida, going so far as to print up handbills with 2 caskets on them, known as the coffin handbills. Modern Americans, disgusted by supposedly negative campaigning, have little appreciation for the intense vitriol of early American politics, which makes 21st century squabbles tame by comparison. I say this all the time. What we have today is nothing compared to the anger and vitriol of early politics. Jackson and his vice president, John Calhoun, coasted into office, winning 178 electoral votes to Adams's 83, in the process claiming all the country except the Northeast, Delaware, and Maryland. Old Hickory, as he was now called, racked up almost 150,000 more popular votes than Adams. Jackson quickly proved more of an autocrat than either the Adamses, but on the surface, his embrace of rotation in office and the flagrant use of the spoil system to bring in multitudes of people previously out of power seemed democratic in the extreme. More than 10,000 celebrants and job seekers descended on Washington like locusts, completely emptying the saloons of all liquor in a matter of days. Washington had no place to put them, even when gouging them to the tune of $20 a week for hotel rooms. This is really astounding back then when a steak dinner cost a nickel. Webster, appalled at the rabble, said, quote, they really seem to think the country has been rescued from some general disaster, sort of the way people thought when Obama was elected. While Clay succinctly identified their true objective. Give us bread. Hang on. I don't know how that came up. Okay, Clay said, give us bread, give us treasury pap, give us our reward. The real shock still awaited Washingtonians. After an inaugural speech that no one could hear, Jackson bowed deeply to the crowd before mounting his white horse to ride to the presidential mansion, followed by an enormous horde that entered the White House with him. Even those sympathetic to Jackson reacted with scorn to King Mob, and with good reason. The throng jumped on chairs with muddy boots, tore curtains and clothes, smashed china, and in general raised hell. To lure them out, White House valets dragged liquor stocks onto the front lawn, then slammed the door shut. But Jackson had already left his adoring fans, having escaped out a back window to have a steak dinner at a fancy eatery. The entire shabby event betrayed Jackson's inability to control his supporters on the one hand, and his lack of class and inherent hypocrisy on the other. He had no intention of hanging out with the people, but rather foisted them off on helpless government employees. Jackson ran the country in the same spirit, having hoisted high the banner of equality in which any man was as good as another and dispersed patronage as none before. Old Hickory relied on entirely different group, an elite, select, skilled group, to actually govern the United States. His kitchen cabinet consisted of newspaper editor Francis Preston Blair, at the time pronounced Blar, scion of a wealthy and influential family, Amos Kendall, his speechwriter as well as editor, the ubiquitous Van Buren, and attorney Roger B. Taney. These individuals had official positions as well. Kendall received a Treasury auditorship, and Taney would be rewarded with a Supreme Court nomination. Perhaps if the Peggy Eaton affair had not occurred, Jackson might have governed in a more traditional manner, but the imbroglio of scandal never seemed far from him. Out of loyalty, he selected a Secretary of War, an old friend, John Eaton, who had recently married a pretty 29-year-old widow named Peggy. She came with a reputation. In the parlance of the day, the other cabinet wives called Peggy a whore and claimed she had, quote, slept with at least 20 men, quite apart from Eaton. Her first husband, an alcoholic sailor, committed suicide after learning of her extramarital shenanigans with Eaton. To the matrons of Washington, most of whom are older and much less attractive, Peggy Eaton exposed the worst kind of threat, challenging their propriety, their mores, and their sexuality. They shunned her. Mrs. Calhoun refused to even travel to Washington so as to avoid having to meet Peggy. Adams gleefully noted that the Eaton affair divided the administration into moral factions headed by Calhoun and Van Buren, a widower who hosted the only parties to which the Eatons were invited, a group Adams called, quote, the party of the frail sisterhood. Adams could write. Convinced that his own Rachel, who'd been socially spurned because of the troubled divorce and its legacy, had died in 1828 of what he thought was a broken heart, Jackson saw much of his departed Rachel in Peggy Eaton and wanted her ostracizing to end. He demanded that the cabinet members bring their wives in line and invite Peggy to dinner parties or face dismissal. But Jackson could not even escape Eaton malaria at church, where the local Presbyterian minister, J.M. Campbell, obliquely lectured the president on morality. A worse critic from the pulpit, Reverend Ezra Style Ely of Philadelphia, was, along with Campbell, summoned to an unusual cabinet meeting in September 1829, where Jackson grilled them on their information about Peggy. Jackson likely regretted the move when Ely brought up a new vicious charge against the Eatons and uttered, quote, by the God eternal, and pointed upwards. Let me read that again. Where he uttered, by the God eternal, at pointed intervals, she is as chaste as a virgin, Jackson exclaimed. Right. The affair ended when Peggy Eaton withdrew from Washington's social life, but Calhoun paid a price as well by alienating the president, who fell completely under the spell of Van Buren. When William Eaton died 27 years later, Peggy Eaton inherited a small fortune, married an Italian dance teacher, then was left penniless when he abandoned her with her inheritance. Absconded with her inheritance, sorry. Meanwhile, she had indirectly convinced Jackson to rely almost exclusively on his kitchen cabinet for policy decisions. With high irony, the man of the people retreated to the confidence of a select, secret few whose deliberations and advice remain well outside the sight of the public. Historians such as Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and others have tried to portray the triumph of Jackson as a watershed in the democratic process. That view held sway until many so-called social historians like Lee Benson and Edward Pessin, using quantitative methodology, exposed such claims as fantasy, thus unable any longer to portray Jackson as the hero of the common man. Modern liberal historians, somewhat predictably, have revised the old mythology of Jacksonian democracy, now explained and qualified in terms of, quote, a white man's democracy that rested on the subjugation of slaves, women, and Indians. The fact is, Van Buren and the states, various factions, it wasn't just Van Buren, engaged in a widespread expansion of the franchise from the early 1820s to Jackson's time. They dropped a number of property requirements for voting, and they introduced the nominating convention, and they basically got rid of caucuses. However, all of this would not really settle in, as we're going to see, until a Whig ran for office, William Henry Harrison, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And it was then, as we're going to see, that Jacksonian democracy really came into its flower and could be measured for a Whig. All right, I will see you guys back here on Wednesday.